Okay, last thing I want to talk about is what's called the replication crisis. Okay, so to understand this, we kind of need to think a little bit about the way that research is done, which is something you guys might not have thought a lot about. If I assume most of you probably have never done research in any capacity before, so it's probably not something you're like super familiar with. But you probably consume research in some way. You probably read headlines about, studies that are done or whatever. And so I think it's important that you understand kind of some of this background. So the replication crisis refers to this idea that a lot of studies, again, in lots of fields, not just psychology, not just social psychology, we do, as scientists, we do studies. The idea is that other people should be able to do those same studies and hopefully replicate them and find the same results, right? If we're on the right track, we're finding the truth with all our theories and our scientific methods, then studies should give the same results if they're done in the same way. But it turns out that in a lot of fields, that's not the case. If you go and try to replicate some of the studies that are published, you're going to end up getting very different results from those studies. And it's particularly bad in social psychology. There were a few statistics I was reading. Again, I don't think I wrote them down, which I should have. But there's studies from I think it started around 2015 is when people really started to kind of systematically dig into this. So from 2015 to 2019 is the studies that I saw mostly, where basically, a whole group of social psychology researchers work together to try to replicate just a bunch of studies, right? So they go into the social psych journals, they find all these studies, especially ones that are cited a lot, the studies that show up in textbooks and they get talked about in classrooms, and they go and they try to replicate those. Some of those studies have found that less than 50% of those studies can be replicated. So they do the study the exact same way, as much as they can, to what was published, but then they end up finding completely different results. All right, so that's a problem, right? Because that tells us that this stuff that's getting published that we're thinking is true maybe isn't true, or there's some sort of issues going on, right, with the way that these studies are being done. So like I said, it's in lots of fields, but it's really bad in social psychology in particular. And it may be due to a couple of things. One of the factors is that when you're working with people, especially groups of people, you're going to have lots of variability in your study conditions, right? If you compare this to let's say a chemist, right? A chemist is going to go do a study with some chemicals or whatever. There are ways that they can make sure that those chemicals are purified and that they can control the temperature and control all these different variables to make sure that their study is the same from study to study. But, think about the studies that I've talked about so far today. If I wanted to do the study I talked about with Chris Meisner, where he brings in students and he accuses some of them of cheating, right? Think of all of the variables that I cannot control in that study. I don't know if the students coming in are going to be psych majors or not. Probably most of them are. I don't know if they're going to be male or female. I don't know what their ethnicity is going to be. I don't know if they had breakfast that morning. I don't know what the temperature is outside. I don't know what clothes they're wearing. I don't know what religion, right? I could just sit here and list off thousands of variables that are completely outside of my control, that I just have to hope that whatever effect I'm looking at isn't affected by those conditions, right? So when you're working with people, there's so much variability that's very difficult to control. Another huge factor is what's called publication bias. And to understand this one, you kind of need to know a little bit about the life of a researcher, which most researchers are going to be professors at universities. Okay, so most of you, when you think of a professor, you probably think that their main job is to teach, which here at LCC, that is the case because it's a community college. I'm hired to teach. I don't do any research or anything else. I mean, I do other things, but not, nothing else is a big part of my job that's going to affect my promotion. But at most universities, at most four-year schools, professors are hired partially to teach, but mostly to do research, okay? And the bigger the university, the more research the professor is going to do. So Iowa State University, where I went to get my PhD, the professors there, their main number one job is to do research, and teaching is kind of a side thing, okay? So if they want to get promotion, if they want to get tenure, if they want to make more money, then they need to publish articles. They need to publish their research in prestigious journals. And journals will only publish studies that have interesting results. And interesting results are usually the ones that confirm a hypothesis, right? If my hypothesis is, I don't know, that, I'm trying to think of something that hasn't already been done just to like not offend anyone that has done research. But, you know, whatever my hypothesis might be, I'm going to get published if I can confirm that hypothesis. All right, so just by the nature of that system, the studies that are going to end up being published are the ones that confirm the hypothesis. There might be thousands of studies that are done on that same topic that don't confirm the hypothesis, but just by chance, you know, every once in a while you're going to get a study that works out the way that you thought it would. And so that's the one that's going to get published. The rest of the studies, the rest of the 100 times I did the experiment and it didn't work, I'm just going to file those away or throw them away, get rid of them, right? So it's only the ones where you find a result that are going to end up published in articles. Yeah, basically. Or it's, okay, that didn't happen, so I'm going to tweak it just a tiny bit. I'm going to tweak just this one little thing and hope that I find a result. Or I'm just going to keep bringing in more and more participants until like someone gives me a result that I'm looking for. All right, and that's what's going to get published. Okay. That whole process that I just talked about, sometimes the extreme is that it can lead to falsified data. So there's one case, there's a researcher named Diederik Stapel. Another name I'll write down. Yes. So Diederik Stapel was a professor in the Netherlands, and he was kind of like a rock star in social psych. So he had published just tons and tons of articles, I think even like books and things, was cited a ton, had all these really interesting findings. And it turned out that he was fabricating or falsifying almost all of his data that was published. So one of the studies that he did that got like a lot of headlines, he found that carnivores are more selfish than vegetarians. So I don't remember the whole setup of the study, but that was the result, is that people who eat meat are more selfish than vegetarians. Another one he did this thing called social priming, and he did a lot of studies around this. Like one example was he brought participants in, he gave them some kind of cover story about what the experiment was about, but he did something basically where like he ended up just talking a lot about age and like old age and what happens when you get old. And then those participants would leave and he would track how quickly they walked. And he found that if they had, this whole story about being old, they would walk slower. But if they had a story about being young, they would walk faster with like more pep in their step or whatever. So those are just like a couple of his, his more famous findings or whatever. There was a whole bunch of stuff that came from that social priming that they did different variations of it basically. So I have notes on him so that I know the dates. So he had a study, one of the studies he first had that was retracted, the thing that he found is that people are more likely to discriminate if they are surrounded by like chaotic environments. So if there's like garbage in the streets and broken sidewalks, then people in those conditions would be more likely to like make false stereotypes or discriminate against other people. That was one of his first studies that was retracted. So he got that published. It was in some article for however many years. And then for whatever reason, I think someone tried to replicate it. I think there was like a team of researchers who were like, okay, this seems interesting. I want to try to replicate this study and see if I can find the same results. They tried, they couldn't do it. They tried again, they couldn't do it. They asked other labs and other researchers to try to replicate it, couldn't do it. So eventually they started to think like, okay, maybe there's something wrong here. They went to the original article, started digging in. They did some like statistical analyses, found out like these results are basically impossible. Like the results he got are pretty much statistically impossible. So, they ended up going through this whole process where they retracted that article. And then everybody started really looking into his research. And they found that almost everything he did was completely falsified. So essentially what he would do is he would set up the study. He would do the study in the sense that he would have participants come into a lab and they would do whatever procedure. But then he would go into his Excel spreadsheet and he would just make up the results. He didn't report what they were actually doing. He would just make it up and then publish, you know, whatever he found from there. He had like over 50, I think it was almost 60 articles that were retracted. They spanned all the way from like 1996 to 2011. So, you know, like a 20-year period that he was publishing prolifically, making tons of money as a professor, getting all this prestige and notoriety, and then it turns out he's just making it all up, right? And the reason he was making it all up is because of all those things I just talked about. Like, he wanted to get promotions, he wanted to get more money, he wanted to get tenure, he wanted to be well known, and the easy thing to do is to just make up data. Yeah.
I mean, is it really like that? Is it really that incentivized to like to make up all of that when like it can so easily be proved wrong just by having somebody else conduct your study again? Like,
yes.
Proven wrong in so many different ways. Was it really worth it? Like,
I mean, the way that promotion and things are structured in these universities, like, I would say yes. It's probably
it's only about like at that time, like you're only thinking about like at the promotion at the time.
Yes.
You're not thinking about what's going to happen in the
Yep.
future.
Yeah. Yeah, so he eventually admitted to all of this, and I think, I mean, it's been a while since I've read like the details of his account, but I think essentially what he said is that it started out, there was like one study where the results were like super close to what he wanted, right? It's like statistically you want to have like P's less than 0.05 or whatever, right? And it's like right there. So he just needed to make up like 2 or 3 data points to like push it to be publishable. So he did it that one time, got away with it, got a publication, got all kinds of like, you know, prestige or whatever. And then it just kind of spirals from there, right? And like, you know, I get what you're saying, like there's people who could prove it wrong, but typically what happens, just the culture of research, right? Like if I read that study, oh, there's this study published by this rock star researcher in some amazing article and I want to replicate it. But then I can't get the same results. Probably what I'm going to think is like, oh, I'm just not doing it right. There must be something I don't get, right? I'm going to blame myself instead of thinking like, oh, this rock star guy that publishes a lot is falsifying. I'm not going to think that. I'm going to think I must just be doing something wrong. So again, I'm going to just throw this away, right? I'm going to just put it away and work on another project. I'm not going to go report that. I'm not going to try to submit it for publication because I know it's not going to get published if I didn't find the same results.
Well, then, like,
so like,
gonna believe you necessarily.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, so there's not really an incentive to like report when your results don't fit what's already published. Does that make sense? So yeah, so then there's this whole system or structure that's built to basically incentivize people who do things like this. Now he's the extreme, but I bet you that it's very widespread and common that people tweak their data a little bit, you know, make little changes to try to push it to fit whatever their hypothesis is. So yeah, so then you get lots of studies that are not easy to replicate. They're not going to replicate because they're not true, they're made up, they're falsified. Prestige, so, you know, I talked about this whole idea of prestige. I think so I'm trying to describe why it's so prominent in social psychology, because a lot of these things are true, like publication, this idea of falsifying data, like that could happen in any field. It could happen in chemistry and physics and biology and history, right? Like any field where research is a big part of getting promotions, you could have that. Obviously, there are lots of fields that are prestigious in some way, but in psychology in general, I mean, this might sound strange to you guys, but social psychology is kind of like the sexy one, right? Like cognitive psychology is like this nerdy thing. There's, you know, like clinical counseling, which doesn't focus as much on research. They're more focused on like therapy and treatment. So social psych is kind of the one where it's like you get these rock star researchers or whatever, and prestige is something that a lot of social psychologists then strive for because that's kind of like the culture of that field. Like I keep saying the word rock star, like literally lots of people call these people rock stars. I've never heard a cognitive psychologist be referred to as a rock star. I don't know if I've ever heard like a physicist or a chemist, maybe, I don't know. But there's just like a whole culture kind of like prestige is really important in that particular field. And then the last thing that's a lot more innocent than all of these accusations is just the fact that, like, okay, so a lot of the participants in studies are going to be psychology students. So typically at those universities when the participants are doing, or the professors are doing research, their participants are almost always going to be students. So like at Iowa State, almost every psych class I took, I got credits for participating in studies, okay? So if let's say you have, 50% of your participants have taken a social psych class, and they've learned about all the things that I've talked about today. And then they go into a study, they go into Chris Meisner's study, and they know what he's researching because they've learned about it in class. They know that he's going to be looking at cheating behaviors or whatever, right? That's going to very drastically change their behavior. If you knew, whenever I did the false memory thing with you guys, if you knew what I was doing going into that study, then it probably would have changed the results. You probably would have thought, okay, she's not going to say the word sleep. She's going to say all these words that are related to sleep, but she's not going to say sleep, so I'm not going to write sleep down, right? Because you would have known. So once you know the point of a lot of these social psych studies, it's going to change their behavior. And so since that's their participant pool, like over time as these studies are published, they're put in textbooks, they're taught about, it's going to be harder and harder to replicate those effects because your participant base knows what you're doing. Does that make sense? Whereas like if I'm a chemist and I'm working on some sodium or whatever, I can be like, hey, sodium, I'm trying to make you react with this thing. That's not going to change the sodium's behavior, right? Whereas in psychology it will. So yes, yeah, there can be biases. We could get into a whole discussion too about just the fact of what I just said, that almost all of psychology research is built on research with psych students. Then it's like, okay, does that generalize to chemistry students or biology students or people who aren't in college at all, or like older people or whatever? Maybe. We'll probably never know because that's how we do research. So yeah. So, that's maybe I will say, maybe I should end with this. There are lots of movements to try to fix some of these things. There are some journals that have specifically started these programs where like you do these pre-registered studies. So what you do now, instead of doing the whole study, getting your results, and then trying to get it published, you go to the journal and you say, hey, I want to do a study about this topic. This is what I plan to do. This is maybe what I expect to find, but this is what I'm planning to do. And then they decide then, okay, that sounds like a worthy study. We're going to publish it regardless of your results. So then there's less of that incentive to try to just like make up results because you already know your study is going to get published regardless of what the results are. So there's a lot of journals that are starting to try to do things kind of that way. Also having like open source data where people have to publish not just their findings as in like the article, but they have to publish their entire data set and all the materials that they used. And then there's ways to go in and kind of look statistically at like whether it's likely that those data sets were made up or not. So there are movements to try to fix a lot of this. So I'll leave you with that more hopeful note. But yeah, that's all for today. If you have any questions, feel free to come up. Those of you who are missing quizzes, or if you want to get your quiz from last time, for those of you who came in late,